Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. It's my favorite space. It's poetry. And so I'm here with our Conservatory Poet Wendy Kieffer. Wendy, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get into it. It's Florida's interesting. You and we're recording in Florida. We
Yeah.
live in Florida. I'm still on West Coast school schedules 8 years later. And so on the West Coast, you go to school into June, like mid-June.
Right.
I don't know if that's similar in your part of the world or where you were from, but out there, it was not like an abrupt stop in May. I'm not used to that. So
Yeah.
we're a
Yeah.
bit into that.
Yeah. It's a little disorienting.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up here.
Okay.
Yeah. I grew up in Florida.
So this is normal.
But even then, I feel like it was the end of June. Like it's been bumping slowly up for years, and now we're in the end of May when school lets out.
Yeah.
I don't remember that growing up. I think that's relatively new.
Yeah, I'm going to have to get used to it. It's like
Yeah.
surfing a different wave. You're
Right.
like, I'm used to riding a longboard. Now this is a whole different thing.
Right.
Very much like that. Well, I think that's why even the regular rhythm, I love the podcast, Lab the podcast we're heading toward 200 episodes. And the hope starting out was that we would create a bouquet, that there would be something in culture, something that we've made together that is filled with life and beauty. And that there's all these different elements. There's beauty in there. There's goodness in there. There's truth in there. There's all these different lives and stories that show us a glimpse of what it is to be who God's made us to be. And that's how we ended up with poetry, this really beautiful gift to irrigate or to water and bring to life that expression. And so that's why we made it the most prominent recurring conversation, which has been awesome to have you on the team and to set aside real estate to say, hey, we're going to talk to authors or people whose lives and work have shown us these different aspects of the life and beauty of the gospel. And then regularly, we're going to return to poetry because it does irrigate. So here's my hope for this, for everybody listening, that's what this would be. And we're still learning to do it together, but that you would find this regular cadence where these conversations are irrigating all of us, and that there's life and beauty springing up around our homes and our tables and our kids. So Wendy, I think that's the gift that poets are bringing to our moment. We've talked about it, that this seems to be culturally, there's a return to this. You've been thinking about this in the way that we can reintroduce poetry to our kids. Have you had an opportunity to see, even in culture, little glimpses outside of our own spheres where you're seeing that?
Well, I was invited by my child's school to come and teach poetry for a day, and that's great.
Yep.
Yeah, that they value it to that degree. So yeah, I think I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing a return to it just in what I follow and what I'm hearing. How there seems to be a lot more interest in it, and I think you're right about it having this powerful ability to help us engage with our world, to help us embody our faith, our senses now becoming a little more in tune. And so then our day is enriched because of what we're seeing and hearing. And poetry really has an ability to help refine that and enhance our overall daily life with God.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a powerful vehicle. I think people are returning to it. I do see a new resurgence of interest.
Yeah.
And I have friends who just are loving this podcast that never thought they loved poetry because they didn't really know how to engage with it. And now they're like, I'm getting all these texts and calls. Like, this is really something I didn't know I loved.
Yeah. I think that's it. Like when you discover a food that you didn't know that you really like,
Right.
Oh, wow, sushi. I thought I didn't do sushi or I didn't understand it. And then, this is now like a part of my life.
Right.
And I grew up, my great grandfather had a piece of property in a particular part of Oregon, and he was a farmer, and he had the richest dirt that you could ever step in. It was like snow. He would till his garden to the point where it was so soft that when you walked into it, you would sink 3 or 4 inches into the dirt and leave these deep, almost like moon boot. If you're an 80s kid, you'll remember like moon boots. You would sink down into the dirt, and you could throw anything into that dirt and it would grow. And because it was just rich soil. And I think that's how a lot of us feel, is that there is a parchedness, a hardness, a dryness to us and to our shared experience. And little by little, I think as we're surprised by poetry, you read Hopkins or something and you just go, I didn't think about my day like that. I didn't think about the tone of a stone in a well. I didn't think about that. But somebody gave me an imagination and language for that.
Right.
You mentioned people who are maybe approaching these conversations go, hey, I hear a poem and I don't necessarily right at first, it doesn't resonate. But by the end of this conversation, I see it a bit differently, right?
Yeah.
Coach us a bit on like what helps that transition take place. How can we set our mind? How do you set your mind to read poetry with like a fresh palette so that you don't kind of create barriers to it being what it's supposed to be?
Right. I think there's several things that aid in that deeper understanding and enjoyment of it. And one of them is slowing down. That we take a good solid bit of time to do one poem because we're savoring it, we're slowing down, we're taking the time to really breathe it in, and even when we unpack it a little and we just kind of sit with it and simmer, it's a real savoring. And then we read it out loud. I think a lot of people are used to just seeing poetry on the page, and there are some poems that insist. We were talking about the Hopkins poem the other day. They insist on being read aloud. And when you hear them, when you hear the power of language and the words, somehow the meaning is just so much easier to grasp than just this flat, and I'm not saying that there aren't moments to just cuddle up with a poetry book and read it silently. But I've gotten to the point now where I'm reading aloud more and more, that even when I'm reading a poem, I'm kind of hearing it in my head. I'm not reading it in the same way that I might read a magazine or, I'm hearing it in my head as I read it. Yeah. So there's something about the sound of it. There's something about slowing down with it, I think, that helps you to engage with it. And I think pushes against our cultural speed. It gets us into that walking speed. Like
hey, watch out now, because it brings to the surface this thing. You bring up Hopkins and that poetry. There's a particular meter to it, and there's a particular sound and feeling that's coming from it. And I was going to say, like, as we go through, slow down, even as you're seeing poetry come across your social media feeds. But I have to say, you might throw something at me because you're a poet, but there's some things that when you do read them out loud, they don't function like poetry. We're calling them poetry in our modern moment,
right?
But they don't have that same effect that a Hopkins poem has, because the way it's structured and written, one thing leads to the other thing and invites you to experience something.
Yeah.
Because it's well crafted.
Yes, and the poem is doing what the poem is speaking of. In that particular poem we were looking at, it's creating a rhythm, and you can only do that if you have a real attention to the language. What I think you're referring to is a lot of poems are written in blank verse. Not free verse even, but blank. And so it has this, it's difficult to engage with. If I even see a poem, let's say it enters my inbox, and I see a poem that has no structure to it, even visually, no stanzas, no organization. It's just like a paragraph of words, maybe even no punctuation. Next, I think there is something that we want some structure. We want a little bit of, we want the rhythm. We want the thing that it separates it from prose. Yeah. And even the poet that we're featuring today, I remember reading an article of his where he said, if you want to really learn how to write poetry, really learn how to read it, he's like, you have to read some of the greats. Yeah. You have to get a grasp on the ability of the language and what it can do, and learn it and sit with it. And even if you decide you have a different style, you still need to know what it's capable of, how you present it, what the rhythm is. So it's important for poetry. And I think it makes it more enjoyable. Yeah. Definitely easier to memorize.
Yeah. We're designed to engage things at an embodied level. Right. And we've forgotten that post-Enlightenment, just the way that we've approached even scriptural texts that are poetic. We've prioritized the content and the information side of it and undervalued the actual expression and
It's true.
lived experience of engaging a truth at like a living text level.
Yeah.
And that's been lost. Here's what's exciting though. I think Dana Gioia said, if you want better poets, you need better audiences. And I think that's part of this, right? That there's that immediate impulse to say, well, we should be able to write in blank verse. Like that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's a credible form of art. You can't really compare. There isn't art's subjective, not objective. And I think what we're pulling on many, many times is it's both. There
Right.
is a subjective quality and there is an objective quality. And if we get better as an audience,
Yeah.
we're going to get better poets because we can refine our taste. And that's a good thing. If you
Right.
come over and I make you something to eat and it's okay, it's a good effort.
Yeah.
But if there's no critical feedback and we don't explore, what would it be if you added this? Or if
Yeah.
there was less salt, or if you brought that out? If the audience itself isn't willing to engage in that way, then I just keep cooking the same bland thing in
Right.
blank verse.
Right. And the people eating it might not know the difference. There was a term for it when I worked in New York at a fancy restaurant at one point, and they would allow us to drink all the like top shelf wines and it wrecked my palate.
Mm-hmm.
It wrecked it.
Yeah.
It just wrecked my palate for anything that was
Yeah.
just, basic, thoughtless wine.
Yeah.
And so we got to wreck our palates a little
Yeah.
and be willing to just say, I'm enjoying the taste of this because I've taken a little bit longer to understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And see, this gets right to the heart of something, because of that wrecking our palate idea.
Yeah.
Even in our economy, even spiritually, as a community made and designed as poetry of God, like that's how he references
Right.
his creation of humans. We have an impoverished view of what it is to be human.
Yes.
And we reference this about Plato's cave. Like, we've existed for so long in the cave, mediated and separated out from the actual lived experience of what we were meant to be. We've said that so many times, but that dehumanizing thing becomes normal to the point, and Plato says this, he says, if somebody comes in and challenges that, you'll want to kill them because they threaten to disrupt the normalization of impoverishment.
Wow.
And what we're saying is, maybe instead of being like, well, there you go, fancy palate, like, don't, what's so important about wrecking people's palates?
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is, I wonder if you were made for more. And oftentimes we're like, well, I don't care about coffee. I'm not a coffee snob. I'm not a whatever snob. What we're saying is, maybe you have more taste buds and more activation with a brain that can understand what's happening on that palate than you've even imagined. And maybe no one has ever shined a light in that incredible capacity, the poetry of God. Right. That's what we hope this can be, with zooming out or embodying and looking through something that we could actually experience joy.
Right. And one of the things about poetry and embodiment is that the poet is creating this little dwelling, right, that we can enter in. But then if we enter into that dwelling and we really take it in, now it's living in us.
Yep.
And it changes our connection to our own language. I mean, language is the most embodied expression, right? And so the more we delight in poetry, the more we stretch our language. I think that is what affects our world and our perception and our day, because we're embodying this language all day long. We're living in this form where we are articulating our view or our emotions, our perspectives through language. And so the more we can engage with that, our sense of wonder, our sense of looking and tasting and being, and then having that kind of language to express it, that will help us to, again, fully alive, accessing that place of wonder and that place that makes us human. And that richness of language. If we lose the richness of language, so much of our day is shaped by our words. We lose the richness of our lives. To some degree.
Well, and the glory of God in the world. St. Irenaeus, the glory of God is man fully alive in the vision of God, like beholding God in relational context to God, radiated by the light of God. The human person flourishes And that is the glory. The flower's meant to erupt into creation.
Yes.
And then to be experienced both between God and that creature, but also fellow creatures.
Right.
And again, this expressive individualism that has said the interior life of my soul is the thing that matters. And what you see of that, don't judge that. Don't look at that.
Right.
Yes, and there's this perspective that says as God radiates your life, something beautiful appears for your neighbor, for the sake of others.
That's
and
right.
so I'm looking at Riley, our producer, but Riley, as you engage the world as a radiated by the illuminated being of God who has this capacity for language that is other. It's not other in the sense of like it's a lesser language. It's this thing that even angels stand back and are like, what is this? Right? As you and I, as we grow in that capacity, that's the glory of God in the world.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
It is.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
So that's part of the exercise. That's part of why poetry, like I hope it's okay for us to take that tangent because that's why we sit down and take time with one poem. To invite one poet to help us experience something. So
That's right.
Tell us about the poet and how we landed where we landed, and then we'll get into it.
So the poem we selected is The Chairs That No One Sits In by Billy Collins. And Billy Collins is another big name in poetry. He was the U.S. Poet Laureate once, the New York State Poet Laureate. He's been around forever. I think he's even in his 80s now. So he is a well-known, well-loved poet. And I think he's gotten the reputation of being the most beloved poet. Like he sells out his readings. People love him. And I'm like, the more I read him, I understand why. He's subtle and he's profound and he's funny. I think people enjoy the way he looks at the world. And he has this conversational way of writing that almost makes you feel like there was no effort to the poem. Like it's effortless. There was. Yeah. They're well crafted. But it's so conversational. It reminds me of Mary Oliver. And where Mary Oliver is traipsing through the woods looking at everything and the rivers and the birds, he's kind of like, you can tell he lives in the city. He's going into Walgreens looking at everything or the subway. And so it has that similar Mary Oliver thing of just engaging with the world all around you. But his is just a little more urban. And I think most people can relate to that now, even sometimes more than just someone who's a nature poet.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's loved. And I think one of the things that makes him special is that he has a real attention to his reader. He's very reader conscious. And he's probably the first poet I've ever read that is just always engaging with his reader. And you almost feel like you're in part of the story. You're in the poem with him. I think that's engaging. I think people want that connection. They want to be, so while he's imagining something, I'm imagining myself in his poem. So we're imagining together, and together that makes the poem.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that even this book I brought, Aimless Love, the first poem in here is titled Reader, and it's just a poem to the reader. And I think a lot of poets now are doing that. When I read a collection, sometimes it'll have an intro about, reader, I'm glad you're here, things like that. But he's really the first one that I encountered that does that frequently.
Yeah. Well, that's beautiful context too, to kind of get an imagination for the poet, Billy, and sitting and, writing this, and it's intended to land in your car or on your walk or wherever you're listening to this.
Yeah.
There is a personal encounter there. So, and then we'll walk through it on the other side. But for now, just kind of clear the palate, everybody listening. And this is Billy Collins in this incredible poem that was written for us to enjoy.
That's right. The chairs that no one sits in. You see them on porches and on lawns down by the lakeside, usually arranged in pairs, implying a couple who might sit there and look out at the water or the big shade trees. The trouble is, you never see anyone sitting in these forlorn chairs, though at one time it must have seemed a good place to stop and do nothing for a while. Sometimes there is a little table between the chairs where no one is resting a glass or placing a book face down. It may not be any of my business, but let us suppose one day that everyone who placed those vacant chairs on a veranda or a dock sat down in them, if only for the sake of remembering what it was they thought deserved to be viewed from two chairs, side by side, with a table in between. The clouds are high and massive on that day. The woman looks up from her book. The man takes a sip of his drink. Then there is only the sound of their looking, the lapping of lake water, and a call of one bird, then another, cries of joy or warning. It passes the time to wonder which.
It's so fantastic. I won't jump ahead, but I will say there is that moment in the poem where all of a sudden you're just standing or sitting there. It's amazing how that took place.
It is really cool.
Yeah.
It is really cool because he's imagining that there's someone sitting in there. So he has the whole second part of the poem is him imagining. So now we're imagining it with him. Mm-hmm. And now when we go out and we look at the chairs, we're going to remember this. This is going to sit in our hearts a little bit. We're going to imagine. So there's something about the imagination apprehending something that is true. And I think that's why this poem is really powerful. So he says, you see them on porches and lawns. So this is outside. These are places where we are now looking for the chairs that no one sits in. They're on porches and lawns. They're down by a lakeside. And we've all seen these chairs. We know exactly what he's talking about. The two chairs, Adirondack chairs usually, yep. Sitting with the little table and no one's sitting on them. But I love how he says it's usually arranged in pairs. So we have this desire to be not alone, to enjoy with, to look out with another. And so we have this sort of, we're outside, we're by a lake, we're not alone. And in these chairs, we might look out. That is our doing. It's just looking out, just looking. It's so simple. It's so simple. And what are we looking at? We're looking at the water or the big shade trees. And so he actually sets this up a little bit like a sonnet. In a sonnet, they kind of present sort of the problem. The beginning of the sonnet usually has some kind of problem. It pivots and then there's a resolution. And I feel like he's doing that here where he sets us up that these chairs are on porches and lawns. You might sit there and look out at the water. And here he hits the problem. The trouble is you never see anyone sitting in these forlorn chairs. And then this line, at one time it must have seemed a good place to stop and do nothing for a while. And I think he's hitting, that's really the crux right there. Stopping and doing nothing on these little chairs that no one is stopping anymore. No one is doing nothing. No one is, but we know that we should. We've set the chairs out there. We know there's value in that. We put them there. Sometimes there's a little table between the chairs where, again, no one is resting a glass or placing a book face down. And I love that he does this because he doesn't call it, there's a little empty table. He could easily say, there's a little empty table. But he says, no one is resting a glass. So the table, as well as the title, the chairs that no one sits on, they are not functioning in their purpose. The purpose for which they were made. The table was made to have you set something on it. The chair was made for someone to sit in it. It's the chair that no one sits in. It's outside of its purpose. So is the little table. It's no one is resting a glass or placing a book face down. And I think he's calling a little bit of attention to our humanness, what our purpose is, and a part of how we were made. Are we living in that purpose, or are we missing it when we set out the chairs but don't sit in them? And then he has here the resolution. He starts in on the resolution, and the resolution is found through imagination, which is great. It may not be any of my business, but let us suppose one day that everyone who placed those vacant chairs on a veranda or dock sat down in them, if only for the sake of remembering what it was they thought deserved to be viewed. What was it that we we thought we had time to sit down and enjoy and view. What was that beauty that we were after? Why did we place those chairs there? Why do we have chairs on our front porches? That hurts, because in this area in Tampa, I see a lot of porch swings and a lot of chairs on the porch, but I don't see a lot of people on the porches running around. So they're side by side. And I love when he goes into this imaginative place to help to lead our imaginations. He says, the clouds are high and massive on that day. The day people decide to sit down, the clouds are high and massive. The woman looks up from her book. Again, there's nothing wrong with having a book in a chair by a lake, but she is involved in another world in that book. She's in this other world. And I feel like in that moment where she's looking up from her book, she's setting that world down to look out at this world. And hopefully maybe that has been, her view's been enhanced by what she's reading, but she's setting it down and she's looking up. The man takes a sip of his drink. I love that he has this line in here because this is the embodiment line. When I read this, I feel that something cold and sweet, and he's taking a sip of his drink. It's a sign of relaxation and nourishment and enjoyment, and it's embodied, and then he puts it down. And then after that, there's only the sound of their looking. That's a poetic.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Poets love this sort of thing where you say it in a slightly different way, and all of a sudden it just has this gong sound of meaning. The sound of looking. We obviously know that is no sound. And yet there's something profound about saying it that way because it's quiet, it's silence, it's stillness, and usually wisdom follows when we are able to get silent and still and slow down. And so what do they find? The lapping of lake water. It's great. The lapping of lake water. I think there's so much joy and peace when you are by the water. And we can get into that a little bit. That's my happy place. But the lapping of lake water and a call of one bird, then another. Cries of joy or of warning. It passes the time to wonder which. So now we've been silent and quiet and still. We're picking up with our senses just a small sound of lapping, now a bird. And now we're led to wonder. Wonder is our natural state. When we are engaging with the natural world that God made, we are made to wonder. But we have to sort of make time to wonder. We have to stop, sit, put our book down, look, listen, and then we will wonder, just naturally. And then that wonder leads to other wonder. You come back from the lake or from the poem, and now you're using that, what you wondered there is now, you're seeing it everywhere. Maybe you're seeing it now in your home or your office, something to wonder at. And it is enriching and permeating your entire life because you stopped to wonder. So I don't know if there's, a line that sticks out to you or that really like, it's that line. But I love this whole poem. I love how subtle it is. And I love that it's using the imagination to speak a truth.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I still do this to this day. Like if you pull a sword out, like as a kid, you get a shiny sword and you would unsheath that thing.
Yeah.
And it was just magnificent. You were like, and like in the samurai or something, you would look at this and just go, that is something to behold. Precise, elegant, masterfully crafted. When you sent this in a collection of other poems, as we were kind of discussing today, this is the one that like unsheathed for me.
Yeah.
And I saw this just razor magnificence of this beautifully crafted poem. Because, and I think, there's so many things. The distance of that sound, like there's a place in Oregon, the Willamette River, where I can almost hear the distance between those two birds, one calling and then the other.
Yep.
And there's a sound by water or a lake where you know what that feels like to be in kind of an amphitheater that God made that functions sonically in a certain way. Yep. One bird, then another. Like we know that spot, right? And you're sitting there and you're looking out. And what hit me was these things about purpose,
Yeah.
right? Forlorn chairs. These chairs are not functioning in the fullness of what they were made to be. Robert Frost, like we could say it every episode, but
Yeah.
poetry has a way of helping us remember what it would impoverish us to forget.
Mm-hmm.
What have we forgotten? What is this helping us remember? And he even calls that to mind for the sake of remembering whatever it was they thought deserved to be viewed from these two chairs. So there's something really beautiful, and that's the unsheathing of this beautifully crafted thing that slices right to separate bone and marrow of what is it, right? And even to do nothing. Joseph Pieper on the leisure is the basis of culture. Leisure, we see that as a void, and actually it's an open and receptive posture to wonder that's actually active, and it's saying we've made time, a good place to stop and do nothing for a while. That do nothing is not to turn off,
Right.
it's actually to widen out and open up and look out to what deserves to be viewed. So what does this help us remember, what it would impoverish us to forget? I think it goes to those forlorn chairs, implying a couple, relational, this context of relating, all of that was in. So I loved that. That's what I saw right off the bat, arranged by pairs, implying a couple. These are forlorn chairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of implies the people that put them out might be forlorn or isolated or forgetting a part of what really makes them human and their lives enriched. You were saying on a couple podcasts ago that the Surgeon General put out that warning about loneliness being the biggest epidemic. You know, the idea that these chairs are in pairs and they're outside and they're not in front of screens. I don't know when this was written, but like they're together and they're engaging with the world around them.
Yeah.
And they're not alone.
When think of this, you mentioned it, and this is what, it's just so good because it's no guilt, no shame, no judgment. Like this is us, right? Where there's this tension. I have chairs on my porch that don't get attention. They're forlorn chairs.
Oh.
And you go, okay, why is it? Well, partially it's 7,000 degrees in Florida, so it gets hot and you get scared to go outside. But those chairs are forlorn chairs. Well, part of what happens for me is you see this beautiful space out there and you go, imagine sitting out there. And then we get it. And this is Lewis on bicycles, right? He's like, first we ride a bike and it's magical and it enchants us and there's nothing like it. And then soon that bike is laid over on its side and we haven't ridden it for a while. And it just, other things little foxes have eaten up our time, and we've grown and we've become bored of that thing. We've lost our sense of wonder. And he says, but it's possible to return back to that bike and to have it do what it was meant to do. And I think that's the invitation of like the distance between a forlorn chair and a chair that's functioning like it was made to be is really one decision: to put your phone down,
right?
To walk outside.
It's good. And my 8-year-old, we were driving to school the other day and my 8-year-old's looking out the window. She's super emotionally intelligent anyway, kind of receptive. And she goes, Mom, I'm seeing all these same houses every day and I'm seeing all the same things every day. And I think I need to see something different. And I thought, well, that's part of the beauty of traveling. It's part of the beauty of newness. When you go to a new area, you taste differently. Everything feels like it tastes better. Like, what are you guys using for your soil? And I think really your tongue's just coming alive because it was different soil, different conditions of growth, it's arranged differently in the plate and the flavors and the spices are different. And so the difference is allowing you to taste it. Same with how you view a new land. All of it is new. The way you engage with it, the newness of it. And so I think it would be easier for me to go down by the lakeside on vacation and really sit in those chairs. Yeah. It's harder when it's on your front porch and you're used to the view and you're used to the rhythm of your life and you're not allowing that time to see it fresh maybe if you buy some new flowers and you plant this beautiful little display in front of your chair, now you've got this beauty you can go and sit and enjoy. And I think there are ways to sort of refresh our view without traveling. And I go back to poetry. When I was having my kids and I felt like it was harder to get out and do things. I had 4 of them in a span of 5 years. And so it was a lot to juggle. And I felt like I was home a lot. Beautiful years, amazing. But I realized that poetry helped me to experience something different, to taste something different, to bring a newness into my world without requiring me to travel.
Yeah. Yep.
But it was that same hunger of like, things are the same and I need inspiration and something to enliven me, and felt kind of grounded with my life circumstances. So I really felt like poetry got me into that place.
Yeah.
So
I think it did that even in this moment,
Yeah.
right? That if we circled something from this conversation and said that we have the capacity to re-enchant, to enliven, to return back to forlorn chairs.
Yeah.
And that it's possible to inhabit those spaces and places and opportunities and see something that maybe is right in front of us, and that it's not as big of a gap as we had thought, and that maybe that's the capacity. Because here we are right on the threshold of summer vacation, and we're all hoping like, oh yes,
the chairs.
Get me to the lake, get
Right.
me to the Adirondack
Right.
chairs, right? And yes, but the power of going to a, workout class is, teach a person to fish.
Yes.
Those maybe this summer, those Adirondack chairs by the lake that you get to find those 2 birds calling out to each other. If the power can be that we go back, but then we return.
Yeah.
Because I think of Jane Jacobs' book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and the way that she describes an urban landscape and what's happening as you look out a balcony or you look out from your front porch. And we would say like, wow, there's nothing to look at out there. Really? Or is there? Because every time I go out there, there's at least one cardinal in that tree right outside my house. And that cardinal is there every time I sit on my porch. There are also neighbors. There are also clouds. There are also animations of our city that I wouldn't have seen. It's all there. I've just been trained not to see.
Right. And there are certain areas that are not as pretty.
Sure.
We stayed in an Airbnb in an area that was really run down, and I was kind of heartbroken by how I was driving by all of these buildings that weren't beautiful. There wasn't a lot of green space, and I thought this is not. It's hard to find beauty here, the way that this is designed, and so I think there might be also that. I think we were talking about this last month when we did the poem about the grapefruit. But they're using the china bowls. There might be something in us that has to go a little extra distance to make it beautiful or to make it appealing.
Yep.
So whether that's going out on your front porch and adding something or engaging with it and putting a little effort into it to make it beautiful, something out there to look forward to.
Yes.
Depending on wherever your space is, I think that can enhance our enjoyment of it. Sometimes my kids are like, I'll say, hey, you want to go to the pool? And they're like, Mom, we have a pool. Why don't we just go in our pool? And I'm like, if I go out in my backyard, I'm like, that fence needs to be repaired and I have to sweep those leaves. And if I go to the pool at the JCC, I'm free. I can just relax. Nothing requires my responsibility. And so I thought I need to take some attention to my own backyard to make it a place that's enchanting that I want to go into. And that, if that fence needs repairing, just fix it. Because there's something about it that's I'm obviously not able to block out. And so give it a little attention and curate your space.
Think about this even in the poem of purpose and design, and what's our purpose as culture makers, as creatives, as people made in the image of God. This is what we're describing is, well, do I really need to go create a curated space on my porch? Well, this goes to Mako Fujimura. Do we really need to put flowers on the table?
Right.
What is it about that act that actually is humans being humans?
Yes.
And when we cease to do things like that, we've been dehumanized.
Yes.
And then, St. Irenaeus, the glory of God is man fully alive. The glory of God is us looking out at something that's not beautiful and saying, right? Cornelius Plantinga, the way it's not supposed to be that way. That's his definition in sin of like this grieving that goes, it's not the way it's supposed to be. That there's, even in our most devastated spaces, that we look out and we have an orientation to say, we can mend that. We can cultivate that.
Yeah.
And that intuition, if you just take one small stitch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about these paper companies, these little fun places you go to buy paper. For $1, you can buy a beautiful piece of paper that is wonderful and lay that under something and put a little glass jar on it. And instantly something's come alive. That it's an oasis where there was a desert.
That's great.
And it's possible.
Yeah. And it's important. I think that he gets to the end and he says, even the call of the bird, is it joy or warning? I think there's a warning here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a warning not to lose this part, not to let this go, not to say the flowers on the table are optional or not important, or making the table beautiful is not important. I think he's trying to warn us that we have to stop. We have to take in beauty. It is how we're made. It's not a an auxiliary or extra thing. No. And even when he says the call of one bird, this is my way my mind works, but I feel like poets oftentimes will listen to bird song and then realize that when they write poems, that is their song. Mm-hmm. That's the human's bird song equivalent, is their own poem. And so he becomes the bird here for me. This poem is like a bird song. Yeah. And we're hearing it, we're tuning into it, and we're really allowing it to come into us, and so that it can live inside of us. We take it out, and now no one who's listening to this podcast is ever going to see those two chairs the same way. Yeah, we're going to be more attentive to what they're offering us and what we may have forgotten.
I love that.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, the one bird to another.
Yeah.
And then this call goes out to everybody who's listening, and we go, wow, is it joy or is it warning?
Right.
I don't know. It passes time to wonder which, right? Like we'll see.
Right.
But as we see chairs differently, and now everybody listening sees chairs differently, and then we start to return back to our chairs and to our spaces, what will we see? And then what will that trigger?
Right.
Will it be joy or warning? My hope is joy, right?
Yes.
And I love that the invitation has been set. So thank you. This was beautiful.
And, hopefully we'll notice the chairs that no one sits in are chairs without their purpose being fulfilled. We don't want to be the humans that never sit, the humans that never wonder, the humans that never stop, the humans that never look.
This is it. More bricks, more straw, total work culture, enslavement, impoverishment, dehumanization, or life to the full. And this radical, incredible redemptive gift that it's finished. And there's an opportunity to live and to participate in living in a way that makes visible something that Lewis and Tolkien discovered, and it seems to have come true.
Yes.
Right? Oh,
good. Beautiful. That's good.
I love it. The chairs that no one sits in. We always wrap by reading it again because we've had time now to go round it and round it. I hope it's helpful. Let's just take the invitation, joy or warning. It passes time to wonder which, but go find a chair. Make it beautiful. All right. You want to read it one more time?
Sure. The chairs that no one sits in. You see them on porches and on lawns, down by the lakeside, usually arranged in pairs, implying a couple, who might sit there and look out at the water or the big shade trees. The trouble is you never see anyone sitting in these forlorn chairs, though at one time it must have seemed a good place to stop and do nothing for a while. Sometimes there is a little table between the chairs where no one is resting a glass or placing a book face down. It may not be any of my business, but let us suppose one day that everyone who placed those vacant chairs on a veranda or a dock sat down in them, if only for the sake of remembering what it was they thought deserved to be viewed from two chairs, side by side, with a table in between. The clouds are high and massive on that day. The woman looks up from her book. The man takes a sip of his drink. Then there is only the sound of their looking, the lapping of lake water, and a call of one bird, then another, cries of joy or warning. It passes the time to wonder which.